Ever wonder what hidden treasures once filled your grandma's kitchen? In this video, we'll take you on a nostalgic journey through 20 forgotten dishes that defined countless American family meals from the 1930s to the 1980s. Each recipe tells a story of resourcefulness, post-war innovation, and simple comfort. Perfect reminders of a time when every bite carried a piece of home. So get ready to revisit flavors that have quietly slipped out of modern cookbooks and join us in bringing these vintage classics back to the spotlight. Number 1. Tomato gravy over biscuits. Grandmothers in rural America during the 1930s and 1940s often repurposed extra tomatoes by creating a savory gravy to pour atop freshly baked biscuits. This thrifty practice thrived in a time of Depression-era frugality, when every home-canned jar of produce was precious. Baby boomers might recall family meals where tangy tomato gravy, thickened with flour and seasoned simply with salt and pepper, stood in for pricier meat-based sauces. Advertisements didn't highlight such a humble dish, yet it lingered in small-town recipe boxes, eventually fading as prepared sauces and tomato-based convenience foods overtook Grandma's scratch cooking. Number 2. Dandelion greens salad. Before supermarkets offered year-round lettuce varieties, many mid-century households harvested young dandelion leaves in spring to create fresh salads. These peppery greens, a reminder of simpler times in old America, were typically tossed with bacon drippings, vinegar, and a dash of sugar. Children of the 1950s might recall how grandparents extolled the health benefits of free backyard greens. This culinary relic connected to both resourcefulness and an understanding of wild edibles faded as urbanization and the rise of packaged salad mixes made foraging less common. Number 3. Codfish cakes. Served during the 1930s through the 1960s in coastal and inland states alike, codfish cakes were a frugal way to incorporate protein when fresh fish was hard to come by. Grandmothers often bought salted cod, soaked it to reduce the brine, then flaked and mixed it with potato, onion, and seasonings before pan-frying into crisp patties. Baby boomers might recall seeing these cakes served with tangy ketchup or homemade tartar sauce. Old commercials rarely highlighted salted cod, so recipes passed largely by word of mouth. With the availability of fresh seafood expanding in the 1970s and 1980s, codfish cakes slowly disappeared from everyday rotation. Number 4. Pot liquor soup. A staple in Southern kitchens, pot liquor, the nutrient-rich broth left after boiling greens like collards or turnip tops, often became the base for hearty soups loaded with onions, potatoes, and bits of ham. Rooted in Depression-era thrift, and earlier, this tradition carried well into the 1950s, particularly among families who remembered how every scrap of nourishment counted. Baby boomers in certain regions recall sipping pot liquor with cornbread crumbled in, a truly old-fashioned comfort that made the most of humble produce. As lifestyles modernized, recipes featuring long-cooked greens took a back seat to quicker meal solutions, making pot liquor soup a rare find outside nostalgic cookbooks. Number 5. Cheese soufflé. While often considered fancy by modern standards, cheese soufflés once graced mid-century dinner tables as a stylish way to impress guests. During the 1950s and 1960s, post-war optimism and the influence of old Hollywood glam encouraged American housewives to experiment with French-inspired dishes. Grandmothers armed with recipe clippings tried their hand at whipping egg whites to airy peaks, folding in grated cheese, and baking the delicate mixture until puffy. Baby boomers might remember the hushed excitement around the oven door, hoping the soufflé didn't collapse. As convenience foods rose in popularity during the 1970s, elaborate baking methods like this fell by the wayside, rendering cheese soufflés an occasional treat rather than a household staple. Number 6. Carrot and raisin salad. Crisp shredded carrots mixed with plump raisins and sometimes pineapple chunks, bound together by mayonnaise or a sweet dressing, embodied post-war America's fascination with quick, bright salads. Appearing in 1950s-era magazines and 1960s church cookbooks, it was pitched as a way to entice children into eating vegetables. Baby boomers might recall pastel Tupperware bowls brimming with this tangy sweet mixture at picnics or potlucks. Over time, the nation's move toward fresher, vinaigrette-based salads in the 1970s and 1980s pushed mayonnaise-laden dishes out of the spotlight, causing carrot and raisin salad to fade from many modern menus. Number 7. Oyster Street. In decades past, especially among families living near coastal areas or with holiday traditions dating back to the early 20th century, oyster stew was a sign of both frugality and festivity. Grandmothers combined shelled oysters, milk or cream, butter, and simple seasonings in a pot, letting the flavors meld gently. Baby boomers who grew up in the 1950s or 1960s might recall oyster stew served on Christmas Eve, reflecting a nostalgic link to old America's maritime roots. As seafood distribution broadened, fresh shellfish grew more expensive, and many households opted for cheaper protein sources, eventually forgetting about this briny, comforting soup. Number 8. Vinegar pie. Sometimes called desperation pie. Vinegar pie was born out of the 1930s Great Depression, when fresh fruit was limited in winter and home cooks needed to mimic the tangy flavor of apples or lemons using pantry ingredients. Grandmothers whisked together eggs, sugar, vinegar, and spices to create a custard-like filling. Baby boomers might have vague memories of older relatives making this thrifty dessert, recalling a flavor both sweet and sharply acidic. By the time the 1970s rolled around, convenience baking mixes and easy-access fruits rendered vinegar pie obsolete, relegating it to a relic of austere times that fewer modern bakers attempt. Number 9. Butterhorn rolls. Delicate, crescent-shaped yeast rolls graced many a holiday table during the 1940s and 1950s, back when homemade bread was a point of pride. Grandmothers carefully kneaded dough, let it rise, and brushed the rolls with butter before rolling them into elegant horns. Baby boomers recall the yeasty smell filling the house, especially during festive gatherings that showcased Grandma's skill with flour and an oven. Old commercials for flour brands occasionally demonstrated how to fold these rolls, featuring cheery mothers in vintage aprons. As store-bought rolls and refrigerated dough became standard in the 1970s, fewer families stuck to handmade butterhorn rolls, leaving them a cherished memory of golden age baking. Number 10. Tomato macaroni soup. A twist on basic tomato soup, tomato macaroni soup combined diced tomatoes or tomato juice with elbow macaroni, onions, and sometimes ground beef or leftover bits of bacon. Grandmothers found this meal especially useful in the 1930s and 1940s, when they needed to stretch a small amount of meat across multiple servings. Baby boomers recall slurping, steaming bowls that mirrored the flavors of classic comfort fare from old commercials touting the convenience of canned tomatoes. As quick microwavable soups and more exotic cuisines took over family mealtimes in the 1970s, hearty bowls of tomato macaroni soup receded into nostalgia. Number 11. Grape nut pudding. Generations of Americans recognized grape nut cereal, heavily promoted in early 20th century advertisements, and grandmothers discovered it could be transformed into a baked custard dessert. Combining cereal, milk, eggs, and sugar, grape nut pudding offered a unique texture, crunchy bits nestled in creamy custard. Baby boomers who spent time visiting grandparents might recall how the distinct malty flavor and warm spices felt cozy on cold evenings. Though it remained in some local diner menus, the widespread push for flashier desserts and convenience puddings through the 1970s led to its decline in home kitchens. Number 12. Ham loaf. Similar in concept to meatloaf but made primarily from ground ham and pork, ham loaf emerged as a popular dish in regions like the Midwest during the 1940s and 1950s. Grandmothers often glazed it with pineapple juice or a brown sugar mustard mixture to cut through the saltiness. Baby boomers recall sliced ham loaf at large family gatherings, accompanied by potatoes and a side of green beans. Despite occasional appearances in old community cookbooks, ham loaf gradually vanished from mainstream meals as fresh cuts of pork and more modern flavor trends overshadowed the traditional approach in the 1970s and beyond. Number 13, scalloped corn. Known for its creamy texture and subtle sweetness, scalloped corn was a beloved side dish at Sunday dinners from the 1930s well into the mid-century. Grandmothers often layered canned or fresh corn with milk, eggs, and cracker crumbs, or breadcrumbs, then baked the mixture until it set. Baby boomers remember the golden crust forming on top, often served alongside roasted chicken or pot roast. Although recipes circulated in women's magazines of the time, the arrival of frozen corn products and more elaborate vegetable bakes in later decades pushed scalloped corn toward relative obscurity, apart from occasional appearances at holiday buffets. Number 14, cabbage rolls. Known by various names, these rolls filled with ground meat, rice, and spices wrapped in tender cabbage leaves were a common sight on Grandma's table throughout the 1940s and 1950s, particularly in households with Eastern European roots. Simmered in tomato sauce, they embodied the era's value on resourceful cooking that stretched protein with grains. Baby boomers might recall the unmistakable aroma in kitchens, especially around holidays or large family events. As faster meal solutions came about and Americans experimented with lighter international fare, making cabbage rolls from scratch became less routine, resulting in this homey dish slipping from everyday memory. Number 15, bean pie. Long cherished in certain African American communities and reminiscent of mid-century resourcefulness, bean pie used cooked navy beans or pinto beans blended with sugar, eggs, milk, and warm spices. Grandmothers who embraced frugality found that pureed beans created a custard-like base, similar in consistency to sweet potato or pumpkin pies. Baby boomers visiting friends or family in urban areas where this recipe flourished might remember its subtle sweetness and creamy texture. Over the decades, as tastes shifted and more mainstream desserts gained ground, bean pie remained primarily a regional specialty, quietly fading from broader household menus. Number 16, shoofly pie. Often associated with Pennsylvania Dutch traditions, shoofly pie was a crumb-topped molasses pie that rose to prominence in the early 20th century and stayed relevant into the 1950s. Grandmothers combined flour, brown sugar, and butter for the crumbly top, which contrasted with the rich, gooey molasses bottom. Baby boomers raised in or near Amish or Mennonite communities recall this pie as a constant at family reunions or church suppers. While it remains available in some bakeries, especially in regions proud of their Pennsylvania Dutch heritage, it's not widely recognized in many modern American kitchens, overshadowed by more contemporary confections. Number 17, Watergate salad. Despite its political-sounding name, Watergate salad was a green, pistachio-flavored fluff dessert that surfaced in the 1970s. Grandmothers embraced it for potlucks or Sunday gatherings, mixing instant pistachio pudding with crushed pineapple, whipped topping, and mini marshmallows. The bright pastel color stood out on holiday tables, reflecting the era's fondness for tinted foods and congealed salads. Baby boomers recall seeing the dish in Tupperware bowls at large get-togethers, symbolizing a quirky slice of American nostalgia. By the late 1980s, health-conscious trends and fresh fruit alternatives overshadowed sweet fluff dishes like Watergate salad. Number 18, homemade root beer. In the early to mid-20th century, families often brewed root beer at home using sassafras root, birch bark, or commercial extracts, especially in rural areas lacking widespread store-bought soft drinks. Grandmothers would combine sugar, yeast, and flavoring, then let the mixture ferment slightly to create effervescence. Baby boomers growing up in the 1950s or 1960s might recall the excitement of bottling day, listening to the fizz when caps were popped. As national soda brands took over the market, the art of homemade root beer waned, leaving behind the memory of a time when do-it-yourself spirit defined local kitchens and summertime refreshment. Number 19, Tomato sandwich with mayo. A summertime staple, especially in the 1940s and 1950s, when homegrown tomatoes reach peak ripeness. A simple tomato sandwich slathered with mayonnaise and sprinkled with salt and pepper could be the highlight of a midday meal. Grandmothers who tended victory gardens during World War II continued the tradition of using fresh produce in the decades that followed, handing baby boomers a slice of bread piled with juicy tomato slices. Old commercials pushed endless spreads, but nothing quite replaced that homemade taste. With the influx of new sandwich variations in the 1970s and beyond, the humble tomato sandwich didn't hold the same allure, though it remains a nostalgic bite for those who crave the simplicity of vine-ripe produce and soft white bread. Number 20, rhubarb crisp. Another favorite during the 1930s to 1950s, rhubarb crisp emerged each spring when the tart stalks were in season. Grandmothers would combine chopped rhubarb with sugar, then top it with a crumbly mixture of flour, butter, and cinnamon. Baby boomers who grew up with backyard gardens might remember sneaking a taste of raw, sour rhubarb before Grandma swiftly stewed it into something sweet. Retro magazines sometimes showcased this dessert as a budget-friendly alternative to fruit pies, particularly when other fresh fruits were out of reach. By the 1970s, easier dessert mixes and broader produce availability shifted household baking habits, leaving rhubarb crisp mostly to those still cherishing old family recipes and vintage garden traditions.